welcome to the Quantum Bridge with myself, Gary, and my co-host, Casper. Now, I will hand over to my co-host, and he will introduce our guest for today.
Yeah, hi, thank you, Gary. We're lucky enough to have a guest with us all the way from, well, not literally all the way from, but via Zoom all the way from Frankfurt, Germany. His name's Daniel. Hi, Daniel.
Hi, nice to meet you, Gary and Casper, and nice to be here with you.
Lovely
Very pleasant.
to see you.
You're welcome.
Lovely to see you. Thank you for making the time to see us. Now, Daniel's somebody that we met on our digital travels, so to speak, and a lovely guy that we believe has a lot to say and stuff that's interesting, hopefully for everybody. We don't understand it, so we're hoping that during this time we will come to understand it a little more. But just to say that the generic area is evidently known as futures, and I can be corrected on that. But Daniel, hopefully you can give us a brief intro to yourself and maybe touch on demystifying slightly that area that I've just called futures and you may have better names for.
Yeah, I can do that, certainly. And thank you for the introduction. Very, very kind. Yeah, I can talk a little bit about futures. We can call it future studies. That's what I studied when I was in Finland. There's also the name of anticipation studies. There's also futures research, but basically it's about futures, so to say. So to narrow it down.
Keep it simple. Yep.
And of course you can approach it in very different ways. We were taught during our study program to learn the tools and methods to anticipate images of the future and to make sense of what might come eventually. But I mean, the field is very broad. It includes designers, of course. It includes the academic research going into the scenario work of environmental modeling, climate modeling, or just in general impact analysis for technologies. So it's very broad in that sense. But I personally I developed my own approaches throughout the years through a lot of failure and errors, so to say, but also throughout a lot of great experiences as well. Few insights. Yeah, in that regard, I really loved to do experimental workshops with teenagers in particular, because as far as I'm concerned, it's much more fun to work with teenagers in that regard, that they really dive into the topics quite quickly.
That's why you're here, of course, I suppose, you know, because we're young guys.
Two other
yeah, you guys are also like the teenagers, which I consider my audience for sure.
Yeah.
No, but it's interesting because I mean, we all know it. When we are younger, then things seem so easy to all of us, and that's how it feels like when you work with the teenagers. So I really enjoyed that. And I was always mesmerized by their reaction and how they utilized the ideas or played with it and created their own things. But to be more specific about that, well, I try to go into a workshop with, as I say, as customized as possible. So it's never like a repetitive game I'm playing. So it's really about understanding the context. It's about understanding what might work or trying to anticipate what might work. And I rather do it like that than to be repetitive with tools that I already learned. Because
Daniel, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
Just for people who aren't at all familiar with this area, historically, would have this been born out of sort of a marriage of philosophy, technology, economics? Is that the sort of direction that futures came out of and maybe still carries quite a lot of that forward with it? Or is it very eclectic? Or actually is futures something that is beyond all of those different things and says, no, that's all happening, but we're going here, we think, and these are the reasons why? And also, the final thing on that is it a science per se, or where does it come under? Humanities, science? Where does it fit in?
No, these are really good questions, and I would think that it's definitely a combination of sciences and arts. It tries to be as scientific as possible, and certainly it is also cutting edge, meaning it attempts to develop its own methodological evolution,
Right.
advancing
Interesting.
further.
Yeah.
But certainly it has been invented at many places during many times. And sure, you can pinpoint H.G. Wells or Jules Verne developing ideas about the future, about in particular technologies in the future, narratives. But even further, I guess, certainly it is philosophically embedded.
And even from the sound of what you're saying, born somewhat out of sort of science fiction to some degree, or the possibilities given by the minds of scientific writers, perhaps.
Yeah. I think the far-fetched and the out there futures, like far out there futures, that's certainly inspired by science fiction. But I think if you really boil it down as well, like any anticipatory process is that's life itself. I mean, we learn walking, we learn not crossing in our form of society, not crossing the streets when there's a lot of traffic. So this kind of anticipatory thinking, this is already ingrained. But of course, to stretch it even further, there indeed we needed science fiction writers and artists and crazy scientists who envisioned possibilities far beyond their lifetime to learn that this is even possible to stretch further. So there's this temporal extension, and we can play with that, and we can learn also to develop our tools and our critical faculties to learn more about that, which in the end is still not anything related to certainty or anything related to we can determine what the future is, but it's I guess a playful approach, and maybe more relating to the understanding that creativity means to know more than one answer. And I think this is what I'm trying to develop nowadays, to really dive into this kind of thinking in pluralistic terms, which is not easy because we always try to, especially I'm German, and we always need to march in one direction, and we always need to find the bullseye, exactly.
Yeah.
So we need to nail it down, right? It has to be correct. And to get out of this kind of mindset and begin to be more flexible, that's indeed a challenge. But I like that, and I think this is important because how else are we going to deal and cope with complexity? Because complexity is not right or wrong, because complexity is much more than any binary yes or no answer.
Absolutely. Just to say a couple of things that have come to mind out of that, Daniel. I don't mean to inhibit your flow, but there's a couple of things. One is I'd love you to touch on the area about how people get into that. Are there certain routes into what you're talking about or not? And also the other aspect of that is, have you seen, and we can come on to this, but have you seen in recent world events over the last few years, that this very much, there is just one way to do certain things? That seems to me to be flying in direct opposition to what you're talking about, even though I imagine the whole area of futures is born out of the same sort of impulse as also what we're seeing. So there's a dichotomy there. So those two things really, how do you get into this, or what are the more traditional routes or the less traditional perhaps? And then given the recent times over the last few years, how does this reconcile?
Yeah, very good questions. Regarding getting in, I mean, yeah, you can do the traditional approach, what I did basically, to study it and get a degree in it. I mean, if that is appealing to you, but there are indeed different schools. There's the Freie University Free University in Berlin. They have a program. I studied in Finland. There's a program in Taiwan, Taipei. There's a program in Houston. There's one in Hawaii, and probably a lot more popping up. But I think, and that's my experience overall, because education is a little bit broken, the education system. So if you really want to dive in, just read a lot of science fiction, just explore the philosophies throughout histories, and find the literature that is appealing to you, and begin to develop your own methodological approach. I'm not saying that it has to be wild and totally uncoordinated, but I think there's enormous value in figuring out the whole thing for yourself, instead of just being fed the let's say the literature from your professors and being told to do it in that particular manner. I struggle with that a lot, and that's why I would nowadays recommend anyone who is interested in the field of futures to explore it individually, and then also team up with people who you like to and prefer to align with. Regarding the other question, what was the other question again?
The other question was more around, given that this appears to be at least a sort of no right or wrong type area, as long as you make a case for why you're getting to certain conclusions, that maybe you can tell me this, but maybe that's enough, or maybe that's seen as good. But there's a number of different possibilities because it's fanning out into the future. But what we've seen over the last few years is very much definitive stuff about this is how certain things should be done and treated. So I just wondered how those two things, can they reconcile? And actually, does futures hold within it a way to somewhat escape or divert from this more blinkered, narrow-minded view of things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was already a little bit foreshadowing that, because indeed there's a technocratic approach to it, for sure. I mean, there's an institutionalized approach to it, and this is really inhibiting the whole creative potential of the of working with futures. And there are also like, let's say, just in general, pitfalls of the field, or errors the field did throughout time, and also a lot of misunderstanding, and a lot of also miscommunication as well. That's a big issue as well, because people are complex, and nothing seems to be absolutely crystal clear. So and obviously there's also a power game going on. There are interest groups. We all know that commercials always also like to tell us the future is this or that. So the field is in a certain manner also being hijacked by commercial interests. And yeah, so that's what I'm trying to say, that the best approach would be really to get a sense for yourself for the whole field. And indeed, reading literature or science fiction, even watching series, can help, but that in itself is of course not enough, because as you say, as you pointed out also in your question, even if you consider science fiction, it's a little bit repetitive, and we have this kind of Disneyfication of disaster porn, right? I mean, a good, intense and suspenseful science fiction movie will need to be catastrophic and dramatic, but that's certainly not the future I wish to live in. So it's of course detached from actually where I want to go with my experiences I try to situate. So there's this, and there's more. So
do you think with those, like you were saying, with the advertising and these other things, how influential is the future thing on our reality? You know, I mean, like for yourself, is it just something you just play around with? But you know, how much impact is it having on us? You know, do people take a lot of notice of this, or is it just in the media and things? How much influence do you think it has on us as a whole?
Oh, it's absolutely more than we can even acknowledge. I think there we need to really, I mean, that's the whole story for itself. That's a great question. I mean, yeah, we need to, where do we begin? But certainly we have this viral infection, and images are being put into, I mean, not like images are being put into our brain, but of course we are being influenced by advertisement commercials. We are being influenced in what we want to aspire towards and what we desire. And all that is, of course, future oriented, right? It's defining and informing our movements through time, where we direct and focus on, where we put our attention towards. So certainly it is super ubiquitous, and it is super prevalent, and we would like to say also in future studies that there's this, the anticipatory assumptions as the predominant authority of our time. So it is certainly
Does that
informing.
even touch on things like predictive programming, for example, in films? There's quite a big area that gets looked at in the more fringe communities, probably, which I think is fascinating, of certain futures played out, and that those futures are bought into and then created by the very people that are being given them. They're not actually created by the people that give them to them. They are actually ultimately created by the people that receive and then buy into them. Does that have any synergy in your world and futures?
Yeah, I mean, in a certain way, I wouldn't even coin it or try to describe it as a vicious process. I think there's a very interesting and fascinating aspect to our reality, that we can indeed weave stories and write ourselves within these stories. So we are observing things in our world, and we automatically, seemingly loop ourselves into what we are observing. And I like to play with that, actually. I like to ask participants in workshops to really write themselves into the equation of what they are projecting onto a future. And I think there's also something where you can discover your own agency again, because indeed we are, I mean, usually socialized and run through an education system and strongly influenced by our parenting and so on and so forth. And I mean, this is, of course, historically speaking, it was probably even stronger generations before us. But nowadays it's very up to, it's up for debate what we want to do with that. And I think it's all this high frequency in terms of change, the acceleratingly changing change, that enables us to really become our own masters of our storytelling, and then again loop ourselves into the whole narrative. I think that's a fascinating process. And if we would learn more of these world building capacities, I think we can indeed create our communities and our desired lifestyles, which would be more sustainable, which would be more enjoyable, which would again align with what the notion of happiness or joy, and mutual learning, and a more community-like experience, not so isolated as we are nowadays, as isolated cells behind our screens, trapped in a digital infrastructure, so on and so forth. I think we can play with that, and I would hope that we learn the skills that can enable this kind of fruitful and dynamic mutual learning experience.
Really, we need new futurists rather than maybe the current bunch. So it's up for us to get more involved, I think, in this process, like we're learning today.
Yeah, and honestly, I think that, futurists, of course, I have this master degree in future studies, but honestly, like, who isn't a futurist? You know what I mean? Like,
absolutely. Yeah.
And the thing is, there's also this beautiful word, I like it, synergy, and there are synergy effects, right? I mean, your biographies and your backgrounds, I don't know much about it, but I know that there's so much experience involved in it, and from joy to tears of joy and richness. And I think when we begin again throughout generations and throughout different cultures and throughout different experiences and backgrounds, begin to align again with each other, learn from each other, and then see what is possible and what are the potentials in going forwards together. I think this is so much more fun, because life is a remix, and that's what essentially also is evolution is about, right? I mean, you get information from somewhere and you learn to you learn from it, and that might equip you with the adaptive potential to become a better person or a better father or a better friend, or yeah, and a better creative artist, and so on and so forth. And I like this. This is really good.
Great.
Gary, have you got any other comments to make? It's a lot to take in, I think.
I know, yeah, that's it. But I mean, the message that I'm taking is kind of what I believe already, that we've given too much of our power away, and it's about time we got a little bit more involved in having a say in the direction we want to go.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you, and I think it's made me feel much more positive about what we're doing with the channel as a platform for different types of people to have their voice, and as a network in itself. And I'd like to encourage anyone out there. I mean, we didn't know Daniel at all. So Daniel was found on a platform, a digital platform, and suddenly we're having this sort of conversation and hopefully bringing it to people who may find this enjoyable too, and open up a whole another series beyond that of network potential for people. So I think that aspect of all of this, and I appreciate that that's not directly a futures thing, but it's certainly this whole thing of us becoming more of a network and actively networking to find those people that we resonate with and those ideas that we resonate with. Daniel, are there any sort of closing comments on this particular podcast recording that you'd like to make? Is there anything, for example, where you ultimately would like to see things going, and just generally in terms of futures as a new force in the world, I suppose, relatively new at least, where you think that may be going as well? I'd like if you can sum things up, and then we can talk about maybe speaking again sometime. That would be a lovely way to end, I think.
No, you summed it up really beautifully. There's only one thing I said with the better. That there's a twist and tail to it, because even if I consider, let's say, developing my own craft and becoming better, seemingly in my own, from my own measurement point, like from my own standard, it can look really alien to other people. And I think this is what futures is also all about, that it might look alien and it might look weird and it might look even threatening or dangerous. But I think that's where we need to listen carefully and don't judge and don't shun, or don't engage in conversations or in our engagements with others with like a occupied mind. I think that's very important, because that creates it inflicts trauma in a certain way, when people try to become the best of themselves, and other people see it as a threat, or as a nuisance. Nuisance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nuisance. Well, yeah,
Nuisance,
I understand.
yeah.
And are you saying with other people coming to you or to others with preconceived ideas as well? Is that?
Yeah, I think we are used to things and we have our comfort zones.
Yeah.
That word is known. But I think that if you encounter something which you didn't expect and it is surprising you, and even if it's a behavioral pattern that might contradict what you are used to, or it's again bizarre or alien to you because you're not familiar with it, I think this is also there's a there's something where we need to be more careful about it, I think.
Yeah.
And I experienced it, as I said earlier, with professors or with superior professionals, and that shouldn't be, I think. And that's a learning lesson by itself, and probably worth a whole I don't know,
absolutely
own channel already. But yeah.
I mean, just a sort of final note on that as well. It does that. We haven't touched on this, but I'd love to at some point. The overlap between the spiritual and this sort of whole area of futures, because of course, in the more spiritual in spiritual traditions, many of them, there is a lot said about conditioning. And you've touched on that, you know, the sort of things that you get from your parents, from your school, from media, from your own country normally, but now in a global village, that's even coming in from all sorts of angles that we don't even necessarily perceive. But that idea of managing to either identify or see through that conditioning to allow your natural self, a more authentic self, to blossom. Maybe that's something that actually isn't that far away from the notion that you're presenting in terms of futures.
Probably, and probably I'm also in that regard joining you with a preoccupied mind in that sense, that I was, when I was 14, I was very much inspired by the movie The Matrix. It came out in 1999.
Yeah.
And so there's also allegedly an awakening happening. But there would be also a lot to say about that. I think that's what we are, living in a matrix in a certain way, even if it's our monetary system or if it's our national agenda that we all seem to be stuck with, in infrastructure that doesn't serve us anymore. And there we can also do a lot of not only innovation, but like rethinking a lot of these designs, because if something doesn't serve us as a entire species and all the other species included, then I think it's not worth maintaining in the
hanging on to. Yeah, agreed. Yeah, absolutely agree. Well, look, I think what we've done is we've hopefully encapsulated something for ourselves and for anybody watching this. But at the same time, we've opened up a whole load of other avenues that, you know, hopefully we can look at in more depth together another time. Gary, is there anything else you'd like to add before?
No, I think that's great, really. And I just think, like I said earlier, I think it's about time. We'll have to see how things go in the future, but I do think we need to have at least a hand in it somewhere. Yeah, that's my thinking.
True, yeah.
Okay, Daniel. Well, look, it was a real pleasure, one, to have found you at all, and secondly, for you to be willing to come on and talk to us. And we'd love to talk to you again. But for now, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you too. Lovely, really lovely to talk to you guys.
Yeah, we really enjoyed it, and we'll talk again soon. And in the meantime, from the Quantum Bridge, thank you very much. Quantum Bridge out.
Bye bye.